Good evening. I'm Lucy Handley, the Adult Programs Coordinator at the Ridgefield Library. Tonight's program is the second of three lectures in a series called The Rise of the Modern in England and America, a look back at 1922. This one is about Thomas Hardy's poems, and the final program will be on April 19th, and that will be about T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. If you have any questions or comments, please type them into the Q&A, not the chat. And now I will welcome Mark Schenker, who's been at Yale College since 1990. He is the Senior Associate Dean and the Dean of Academic Affairs. He's a former lecturer in the English department at Yale, got his PhD from Columbia with a concentration in 19th century and early 20th century English literature. Welcome, Mark Schenker.
Thanks, Lucy, and thanks to the library for having me for this three-part series. It is a look at the rise of the modern, focusing on 100 years ago this year, 1922. The first thing that has to be said is that Hardy was writing poetry for more than half a century before 1922, although he did live into the 1920s and was publishing poetry. He was born almost 20 years before A.E. Housman, which means that he's born in 1840. He was a young man when Dickens died in 1870. He was alive in the period of Victorian novel flourishing. He wrote Victorian novels. He's considered one of the great Victorian novelists, and he had the good fortune to live well into his 80s, dying in 1928, which means he witnessed the First World War and also the sinking of the Titanic. He wrote poems about both those events. I remind you that one aspect of the modern, that is the period of the 20th century between the two world wars, when we talk about the modern in literary art in England and America, is that it is a turning towards the primitive for artists and intellectuals who have become distrustful or despairing over the promise of technology. It's a return to what is elemental, what is basic. If you read Hardy's novels, he's a novelist of the terrain. He's not an urban city novelist the way Dickens is so often. You could read a Hardy novel like Tess and not be completely sure what century you're in. You see some of the poems we're looking at tonight have a kind of age-old quality to them. Last time when I talked about Housman, I mentioned how somber and stoical, how much he's involved in life and death. But he had the comfort of the classics and the idea that the glory of civilization in Greece and Rome was still available to people in the 19th and 20th century. There is a line in one of his poems that I pointed out last time. This is Housman. As somber and as stoical as he is, the land of lost content, the land of lost content, thinking about his happy childhood. You do not get the feeling in reading Hardy that the narrator of these poems even had a lost content. You have the sense that there never was a happy time to look back on. And that's because there's a absolutely pessimistic strain in Hardy. Late 19th, early 20th century was a very rough time. Many people worried that something like the First World War would happen. He uses the sinking of the Titanic as an emblem of the failure of technology and progress, and how elemental things like an ocean and an iceberg can win out. Now, he rejected the label of pessimism. He said he was a meliorist, M-E-L-I-O-R-I-S-T. That is one who thinks the world is ameliorating, sort of improving. If you have to invent a new word to describe your point of view, that's worrisome in itself. He is absolutely pessimistic, but he makes great art out of the pessimism, as I hope to show you. I hope to cover a number of these poems, and because we're talking about ideas in this hour, I'm mainly going to talk about the content of the poems. I wish I had the time to also talk about them poetically, but I'll do that in little snatches. So Hap, the first poem in the handout, and I hope you have the handout with you, is a sonnet. It divides up, as some sonnets do, into 8 lines called an octave and 6 lines of a sestet. And I'll point out that the first stanza says if, the second stanza says then, and the last stanza says, but not so. If I could know my suffering had some perverse purpose in the world, I might actually feel better if there was some sadistic God who enjoyed my suffering, but not even that so. It's just a crapshoot. These purblind, these purely blind doomsters had readily strewn blisses about my pilgrimage as pain. What is actually dispiriting is not that I live in a world where evil visits me intentionally. It's just accident. It's just circumstance. And I'll point out that it follows a sonnet sequence of the alternating rhymes, me, thing, see, ting, die, ted, I, shed. And then the last two rhymes of ain and own go this way: slain, sown, rain, moan. That's a pattern. Oh, strown, pain. That is, the rhymes are reversed. Instead of ain and own, the last two rhymes are own and ain. Just when he's talking about it might have just as easily been this as that, he switches the rhyme scheme. It's a small thing, but it's part of what makes the poem a poem. You see the language: suffering, sorrow, love's loss, ire, tears, slain joy, unblooms. That unness, that why does a hope unbloom? What does it mean to unbloom? Because you're hoping it will bloom, you're desperate for it to bloom, you're waiting for it to bloom, and it doesn't do it. The unblooming becomes a kind of negative growth, as if you can experience the absence of the blooming. Hardy is a poet of the prefix un. He's also a poet of the word but, you see, but not so. And the idea that this sonnet is not so much a lyric of emotion, but an argument, if this, then that, but not so, follows in a long tradition that dates back at least to Shakespeare, where Shakespeare's sonnets are best understood not as love songs or love poems, but as little arguments, little pieces of rhetoric in keeping with the emphasis on rhetoric in the Renaissance. So if you turn to the second page, I look into my glass, my mirror. These are 3 end-stopped quatrains. That is, each 4 lines ends with a full stop sentence. So it has a kind of economy to it. And it's written in iambic trimeter, 3 beats to a line, a much shorter line than the sonnet that we just looked at. So each of the 3 stanzas ends with a full stop. I look into my glass and view my wasting skin and say, would God it came to pass my heart had shrunk as thin. For then I, undistressed by hearts grown cold to me, could lonely wait my endless rest with equanimity. But time to make me grieve, heart steals, let's part abide, and shakes this fragile frame at eve with throbbings of noontide. Now, I don't know if you're of a certain age, and maybe you don't have to be of a certain age to feel the poignancy, but this is a remarkably economical poem that goes straight to the heart of many people. I wish if I had to grow old and my body was wasting, I wish my heart would shrink as well, because then I could get by feeling less, having lost friends and loved ones. But time to make me grieve, that is to do what the God of the first poem didn't do, hurt me intentionally, gives me some things and takes away others. What it takes away is my bodily vitality, but what it leaves me is my memory, my emotional need. And so that combination, the tragic mix of human nature, shakes this fragile frame at eve with throbbings of noontide. I feel the passion that I used to feel when I was young. There was a friend of my family who was a Roman Catholic Monsignor and then a bishop, and I was a visitor to him when he was in retirement, and he was well into his 80s when he shared with me that there wasn't a day that goes by that he could not remember something about his being a very young person. But those moments of memory were shorter and shorter. That mix. And that's the key to Hardy. That is to say, he knows that human nature is a mix of passion and loss. And that's one of the things he's investigating. This poem is published in 1898. Part of the zeitgeist is the fin de siècle, the sense that the century is running down. Many people in different centuries believe that if the world's going to come to an end, it's going to do it neatly, and it's going to come at the end of a century, whether you think that's 1900 or 1901. There's a debate about that. I recommend to you a poem by Emily Dickinson on the same theme, very moving also, called The Saddest Noise, the Sweetest Noise. If you have a collection of Dickinson where the poems are numbered, it's number 1764. If you look at the bottom of that same page, and remember, this is a little bit of a whirlwind, but I am available by email later today, tomorrow, in the future, if a question comes to you later. In time of the breaking of nations, this is a good example of a poem that does use the elemental in a positive way. This is much more positive than some of the other poems, if you allow that it's positive in the comparative sense of a Hardy poem. So, only a man harrowing clods in a slow, silent walk with an old horse that stumbles and nods, half asleep as they stalk. So only this on the sort of landscape. And then Roman number 2, only thin smoke without flame from the heaps of couch grass. Yet this will go onward the same, though dynasties past. And he wrote a long poem called The Dynasts, and he was interested in the idea of the old empires and old royal houses. And of course, what was the First World War but the failure of those old empire and houses to avoid petty spats that turned into a global conflagration. And then Roman numeral 3, yonder a maid and her white come whispering by, war's annals will fade into night ere their story die. That is to say, the one thing that will persist is the notion of love, or you might say lust or sexual attraction or procreation. Notice that the man doing the plowing and the thin smoke coming from burning grass could be in any century. There's nothing contemporary, nothing mechanical, no machines, no reference to anything that puts it in a certain time. Before their story dies, war will die first. Now, you may say that's not exactly the kind of hopefulness you're looking for, but that's about as close to positive as another poem that Hardy gets. I want you to look at In Tenebris on page 3. I leave it to you to look up some of the references. Again, if this were a poetry lecture in the sense of how to read poetry, and I've done that many times in many places, we'd spend more time on the particulars. I'm trying to cover the terrain. I just want you to look at the poem and notice that the first stanza in the second line has the word but, and the second stanza in the second line, but, and the fourth stanza, and the fifth stanza, and the sixth stanza. But. That's Hardy. That notion of maybe, but no, this, but no, that oppositional sense that things might have been, but are not. On the next page, page 4, I'm going quickly now so I can slow down at the end when we get closer to the 1920s. He wrote a poem that he purported was written on the 31st of December, 1900, which he thought of as the last day of the century. Some mathematicians would argue it would be a different year, but I'll leave that for another day. The Darkling Thrush, that is a thrush in the dark. There's a long tradition in poetry, not just in England and America, of having birds be the subject of a poem, To a Skylark, Ode to a Nightingale, one of the greatest poems written in English by John Keats. Birds have a special fascination for poets because they do two things that poets like to think of themselves as doing: singing and flying, at least in imagination or in song. And what's true of this poem is that its bird is a hardy-esque bird. It is aged and frail and gaunt and small in blast-beruffled plume. And yet he's singing and flinging his soul upon the growing gloom. Hardy's all of 59 at this point, not an old man. And this poem ends with this stanza: so little cause for carolings, it is the holiday season, late December, of such ecstatic sound was written on terrestrial things afar or nigh around. I saw no reason why this bird could be so happy, that I could think there trembled through his happy goodnight air some blessed hope whereof he knew, and I was unaware. There's the un again. The bird is aware, the speaker is unaware. But the suggestion is there may be some blessed hope out there that the bird is aware of, and I'm not. About, again, as positive as Hardy gets. It is a commonplace at the turning of a year, with a new year coming, to hope for better things. Certainly with a new decade or a new century coming, you might feel that even more. I want to pause now and look at the Orphaned Old Maid on page 5, 3 end-stop quatrains that tell a story. And these are written in a rhythm that's different from all the other poems in this handout. It's written in 4 beats per line, that's tetrameter. Many English poems are pentameter, like Shakespeare's sonnets, 5 beats to a line. That time of year thou mayst in me behold, paradise lost. Many meditative, contemplative poems are written in English in iambic pentameter. It's a kind of stately rhythm. But this is a shorter line, and instead of iambs, bum, 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 that time of year thou mayst, every second line syllable getting the beat. These are written in anapaests. That is 3 syllables, beat, no beat, no beat. I wanted to marry, but father said no. 'Tis weakness in women to give themselves so. If you care for your freedom, you'll listen to me. Make a spouse in your pocket and let the men be. I'm reading it artificially to make the point that it has a kind of sing-song quality. I spake on't again and again, father cried. Why, if you go husbanding, where shall I bide? For never a home for me elsewhere than here, and I yielded, for father had ever been dear. But, the hardy word, but now father's gone, and I feel growing old, and I'm lonely and poor in this house on the wold. And my sweetheart that was found a partner elsewhere, and nobody flings me a thought or a care. 1909, and a poem that could have been written in the 13th century. That's the point. This is a very common thing in England, Wales, and Ireland, that fathers who no longer have wives want their daughters to stay home to be surrogate wives. I do not mean in any sexual or illicit sense. They want a housemaid, they want a domestic partner to care for them, and very common, certainly was true in Ireland for centuries, that women felt bound by guilt, by family pressure, and God help us, religion, to do their duty to their father. Again, I'm not suggesting anything sexual. I wanted to marry, but father said no. 'Tis weakness in women to give themselves so. Again, that notion that there's something illicit even about marital sex. If you care for your freedom, you'll listen to me, make a spouse in your pocket, and let the men be. Now, there's a debate I can't say it's actually, that hot and heavy in terms of you're reading about it on the local news. But make a spouse in your pocket, some critics have suggested, save your own money and let the money that you save be your companion. I don't think that's very persuasive, in part because there's nothing to suggest that this house on the wold, where the woman now is lonely and poor, presented any opportunity for her to have money. Doesn't sound like her father was going to give her any kind of legacy. It's much more likely a reference to the idea that if she needs to gratify herself sexually, she can find her own hand in her pocket. There is a long image tradition of people who keep their hands in their pockets being associated with self-gratification. Partly it's the notion that your hand isn't out to greet people, to hug people, to shake hands. Partly it's an image of miserliness, keeping your hands in your pocket on your money. Freud was famous for associating the idea of you're not spending money with being a kind of anal or constipated, not giving of yourself. I think it's much more likely that what he's saying, you can pleasure yourself and you don't need men to do that. So another sort of dark component of this little drama. I yielded, for father has ever been dear. She did her daughterly duty, but everything changes with father's gone. I feel growing old. I'm lonely and poor in this house on the wold. And my sweetheart that was found a partner elsewhere. She had a chance, and nobody flings me a thought or a care. That verb fling says everything. They won't even toss her a bone. Now, this is 1909. Hardy has given up writing novels because he felt oppressed by the censorship of the late Victorian critics and editors, and he turned to writing poetry. And he went from being a very great Victorian novelist to being an extraordinarily great modern poet. But in these 12 lines of sing-song verse, with almost no word that would trouble a middle schooler, I think, husbanding in the sense here of going hunting for a husband, a very rhythmic and pleasant sing-songy rhyme. He's made a little drama, and you see the force of him as a writer of fiction to create this mini drama of this orphaned and now aging maid, the orphaned old maid. I think a remarkable poem. So we're still before the bottom of the hour, which is what I hoped for, because I'd like us to spend some time on the convergence of the twain. The Titanic went down in 1912, and there was in England a number of memorials and events to raise money for the widows and orphans of the people who died. And Hardy was invited to participate in that. And he wrote this poem, The Convergence of the Twain, the meeting of the two, on the occasion of the loss of the Titanic. And so it had a kind of preeminence in its day. Now, I'll say, first of all, when we talk about irony, and I will be talking about irony, the modern age is fascinated by irony. How ironic it is that I suffer not because there's some sadistic God that wants to punish me, not because I've done anything to be punished, not because the sadistic God just likes to see me suffer. It's just crapshoot. It's just dicing time. It's just the bad luck of hap. If somebody were pitching a movie in the 1930s, let's say the Titanic had never been lost, to a movie producer and said, I have a hell of a script. I'm going to imagine that a ship, a state-of-the-art ship, is created in England, let's say Southampton. Let's say it has extra sealed compartments below the waterline so that it can survive hitting of an iceberg with as many as 4 of those compartments flooded. But in my plot, it hits an iceberg. Many of those compartments fill up. And this state-of-the-art ship, let's call it Olympian. Wait, let's call it Titanic. It actually sinks, killing many people. And I'm thinking that it would sink on its first voyage out. You can imagine the producer saying, look, I think it's interesting, but the first voyage, isn't that kind of pushing credibility? Why not make it the third or the fourth voyage? Why be so heavy-handed? All right, maybe so, maybe not. But no, the world said, no, the first voyage, the state-of-the-art ship, the unsinkable Titanic, got hit by what? An iceberg in the North Atlantic. Who saw that coming? And it sank on its first voyage to America. Unbelievable. And as I tell my students teaching literature for years, the reason why truth is stranger than fiction is that fiction feels compelled to be believable. And truth does not have to be believable. It just has to be true. And everyone in this room, whoever you are, whatever age or experience, everybody in this room has seen something in their private life, in their family life. We've all seen things in our public lives that are absolutely unbelievable, and yet they've happened. And that's one of the things that fascinates Hardy. So he decides to write this poem on the Titanic to investigate what would the fish say below the surface of the sea in seeing the vaingloriousness of what human beings have created in their progress, in their technology, 12 years into the 20th century, that the elements can confound. It was done in by an iceberg that is frozen water. So here we go, the convergence of the twain. In a solitude of the sea, deep from human vanity and the pride of life that planned her, stilly couches she. So you see all three rhymes, a triplet, not couplets, but three rhymes in a row throughout the poem. Steel chambers late the pyres of her salamandrine fires, cold current thrid and turn to rhythmic tidal lyres. Threaded, cold current threaded. Over the mirrors meant to glass the opulent, the sea worm crawls, grotesque, slimed, dumb, indifferent. Absolutely elemental, a sea worm that could be prehistoric, an absolutely elemental creature crawling over the surface of this testament to human ingenuity. Jewels in joy designed to ravish the sensuous mind lie lightless, all their sparkles bleared and black and blind. And you see the heavy-handed alliteration. Dim, moon-eyed fishes near gaze at the gilded gear and query, what does this vaingloriousness down here? That's the Hardy setup. What other poet would have thought, let's talk about this loss of the Titanic, not from the dramatic action that happened hitting the iceberg. And again, he was certainly capable of writing such a scenario. But let's imagine what the elements would think of this out of place thing. Well, matter of fact, while I was fashioning this creature of cleaving wing, can cut through the water, the eminent will that stirs and urges everything prepared a sinister mate for her, so gaily great, a shape of ice for the time far and dissociate, far away and absolutely disconnected to what's happening with the ship. And as the smart ship grew in stature, grace, and hue, in shadowy, silent, distant grew the iceberg too. Alien they seemed to be, that is, completely foreign to one another. No mortal eye could see the intimate welding of their later history, or sign that they were bent by paths coincident on being anon twin halves of one august event. Till the spinner of the years said, now, and each one hears, and consummation comes and jars two hemispheres. It was fated that this would happen now, the consummation of this disaster comes and jars two hemispheres. It's a remarkably distinctive poem, but it is modernist through and through in its economy, in its leanness, in its refusal to make the death of people sentimental or moving. Remember, it was written just months, maybe even less than months after the tragedy happened. Hardy uses it as an occasion to make the point about human vaingloriousness and the power and persistence of the elements, the water, the iceberg, the fish, the sea worm. When it says that what will outlast wars are the lust or love or procreative urge between a country boy and girl or a man plowing a field, that positiveness is also here in the negative view that the elements give a moral correction to human vaingloriousness. This is very Hardy. In the same decade of the 20s, we aren't there yet, but we're getting there. D.H. Lawrence is writing as a modern British novelist, a celebration of the land, of elemental power, of the power of intercourse and sex as a primal force that's more important than modernism. All of Hardy's novels are about his hoped for primacy of the physical, the erotic, the sensual, the biological over the theoretical, the scientific, the idea of intellect as betraying the essential nature of man. D.H. Lawrence is not a dirty writer. He is a missionary for sexuality. And one of the remarkable things about Lady Chatterley's Lover is that Lady Chatterley's lover, Mellors, the gamekeeper of her husband's estate, uses the F word often, but he uses it as the verb for what it's supposed to be, that is what it refers to, the act, and never uses it as an expletive. It's not a dirty word for him. It's a coarse word because he's a coarse person, but he uses it as a verb. And in my experience, my limited experience with respect to foul language, almost nobody I know ever uses it as a verb, that is as a real actual verb. Even when they say go blank yourself, they don't mean it as a verb, they mean it as a curse. And it's much more used as an adjective. D.H. Lawrence, like Thomas Hardy, born in different periods, but writing alive at the same time overlapping, are trying to recapture something of the force of nature in a culture and society that's lost respect for the power of the elemental. So Channel Firing, or the poem on the next page, ends with references to Stourton Tower and Camelot and starlit Stonehenge. The poem sets up the notion that the dead are awakened by the great guns that disturb those who are buried in a churchyard cemetery. We know it's a churchyard because there are references to Altercrum and the chancel with the window squares and a glebe cow. A glebe cow is a parson's cow. And we're assured that this isn't Judgment Day. This is just people fighting. And that when it's time to come, we'll know the difference. Again, last stanza. Again, the guns disturb the hour, roaring their readiness to avenge as far inland as Stourton Tower and Camelot and starlit Stonehenge. Well, Stourton Tower was built in the 18th century to commemorate the end of the 7 Years' War in the middle of the 18th century, England versus France. That is a couple of centuries before the poem is written. Camelot, of course, comes from myths of the Middle Ages, but again, a British location. And Stonehenge comes from prehistory and was only some short drive from where Hardy himself was raised and where he was living at the time that he wrote this poem. He returned to his childhood home to live out his last years. And those ancient memorials are memorials to things that persist, but would also persist is the violence and the war that competes in April 1914 with the end of the world. You see in the first stanzas, we have the howl of the hounds and the worms drawing back, never far from the elements in Thomas Hardy. Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which is one of his several masterpieces and my favorite of his novels. Tess is partly confounded by the fact that she has to walk everywhere she's going. She has a horse in the beginning of the novel that is her father's horse, and she's making a delivery. The horse is ironically named Prince. And because she's exhausted for reasons I won't go into, she drowses, she falls asleep, moves into the wrong side of the road, and her horse's chest is impaled by the hood ornament, let's say, of a postal vehicle. The mail has to go through, and her horse is killed. And for the rest of the novel, she's blighted and always on the wrong side of things. Bad luck, constantly bad luck. And part of what does her in is she doesn't even have access to a horse later on. If she visits a relative, she has to walk there. And she is raped by a distant relative who she's going to try to see if he can provide any support to her family. And she can't fight him off because she's so exhausted from walking. She's done in by distance, the elements. So there is no better example of the economy of Hardy's buttness, what I'm describing as that butt, than this late poem, Going and Staying, published in 1920. So we're getting close to that 1922, the rise of the modern in this period. You see he had a head start. The gloom, the negativeness comes from decades before. But once the First World War happens, it's as if everything that Hardy was unhoping about, everything that he had no reason to think would get better, was confirmed by the World War. For peace in our time, a war to end all wars. So I'll point out that each of these stanzas with the additional line that's repeated at the end in the first two has, again, a kind of sing-song quality and rhymes A, B, A. So spray, flowing, may, stay, going. Very, very rigid structures in these. Nothing like free verse or blank verse. Free verse, which would come later, blank verse, which came a good deal earlier. The Roman numerals are his, which suggests that he meant it to have a kind of formality. You'll see the word but at the end of the first two stanzas. I'm not just making this up. The moving sun shapes on the spray, the sparkles where the brook was flowing, pink faces, plightings, moonlit May, these were the things we wish would stay, but they were going. Seasons of blankness as of snow, the silent bleed of a world decaying, the moan of multitudes in woe, these were the things we wish would go, but they were staying. Now, if we ended it there, that would be bad enough. If you're waiting to buy tickets to Thomas Hardy's poetry, the musical, stop waiting. Lin-Manuel Miranda is not going to convert this into a Broadway hit. This is a very dark poet. But if those were the only two stanzas, he's speaking about an elemental truth of life. The things that we most care about, pink faces, whether they're of children or people who hope, the plighting, betrothing, marriages, moonlit May, the things we wish would stay go because that's why we wish they would stay, because we value them, we want them to stay. And those things that we wish would go, and what better line to encapsulate everything that Hardy's been saying this evening than the silent bleed of a world decaying. There's a Hallmark card for you, the silent bleed of a world decaying. They're staying. Emily Dickinson has written poems on this very subject. Robert Frost has a lovely poem with the title, Nothing Gold Can Stay. And gold here doesn't just mean gold in the sense of the precious metal, but gold in the sense of a golden sunset or golden fruit. Yellow, I learned when I was very young, is the color of sugar in nature. So golden fruit doesn't stay. When it gets to that perfect ripeness, if you wait too long, it rots. And nothing gold can stay because that's what we define as valuable, the things that go. People have said that one answer to what is the meaning of life is that we die, that mortality, the passage of time, mutability makes things valuable. And Hardy gets that. And the first two stanzas would be a stunningly economical suggestion that this is how life works. We long for the things that leave and we regret the things that stay. But then Hardy gives a but to his but. 3, implicitly, but, there's no but implicitly, but then we looked closelier at time and saw his ghostly arms revolving to sweep off woeful things with prime, things sinister with things sublime, alike dissolving. That is Hardy exponentially squared. We might think there's a kind of odd logic that what we value leaves us and what we regret stays. And then Hardy says, no, actually, everything goes, everything dissolves. I mentioned last time with Housman that he was writing coming of age as a poet, started late in his career, in the period of human literature and history that Nietzsche declared that God is dead. And in German, it's much more powerful. Gott ist tot, kind of rhyme. God is dead. Many people still believe now in an afterlife and personal salvation and God. But in the last decades of the 19th century, it became possible to suggest that there was no God. The word agnostic was created by Thomas Huxley to explain that notion that we can't know what we can't know. And there was a new sense that maybe there's nothing after death that had a result in a lot of this fin de siècle, either decadence, embracing the idea of decay and licentiousness and other extreme examples of behavior, or being despondent, that Hardy is trying to analyze in a more literary way than just woe is me. Alike dissolving, that notion that things are just evaporating. So Christmas 1928 is not the last poem that Hardy wrote. He dies in 1928, but it's certainly one of the last poems. And in the collection of poetry that was published late in his life, I'm sorry, Christmas 1924. This is what I get for taking off my glasses. Christmas 1924, 4 years before he died. It was not the last poem that he wrote, but in the volume in which it appeared, it was the last poem. And there was a tradition for some decades that collections of Hardy's poetry ended always with Christmas 1924. We don't have any evidence that Hardy asked for that to happen, the way some poets have asked for a certain poem to be the farewell poem in their volume. But it's as good and sending off as any for Hardy. Very unlike him in terms of not being multiple stanzas, very, very economical and brief, and of course, loaded with irony. Peace upon earth was said. We sing it and pay 1 million priests to bring it. After 2,000 years of mass, we've got as far as poison gas. The poison gas of the trenches of the First World War, that is technology coming to the aid of destruction, a kind of early weapon of mass destruction. And I want to parse this a little bit because it shows you the power of poetry. Poison gas being used in the trenches of France in the First World War wreaked havoc on the English imagination, you may not know that many of the soldiers who were furloughed from those trenches actually came home to England for their furlough and then were sent back to war. It's not a long crossing across the channel to come back to England. And that made it that much more horrific that the war was not going on at home in the same way, and that what they were experiencing in France was a combination of utter elemental devastation, muck and gangrene, the inability in all quiet on the Western Front. Eric Maria Remarque has one of his soldiers, one of his German soldiers, say that the dysentery was so bad, the men stopped pulling up their pants. It just made no sense to pull them up. A combination of that elemental devastation, where men were dying and fighting over inches of terrain, where men in no man's land on the other side of the trench and the wire could be heard dying. You could smell the bodies rotting, that horror of the opposite of civilization. And connected to that, the technology of warfare, including cannon fire, more sophisticated machine guns, and of course, poison gas, something that would be unthought of during the Crimean War, when you might die from a saber cut and not from choking to death. Before there was any international agreement to ban such things. And that he rhymes poison gas with the Christian Mass is the height of irony. Rhyming in poetry is sometimes underrated because we think of it as so common and maybe a little infantile. All children, I have a 2.5-year-old granddaughter, all children love rhyme. Educators believe that rhyme is the entrance to loving reading. We know that children love rhythm. I taught for some years a pre-kindergarten workshop on poetry at St. Thomas's Day School in Hamden, a couple of miles down the road from where I'm sitting now in my Yale office. And I told the headmaster I would do it if I could do it in the gym. And I taught poetry with the children bouncing balls and stomping. And it's believed that we are born loving rhythm because the first sound we hear before we enter the world is our mother's heartbeat. And one of the things that rhyme can do is it can not only soothe us by fulfilling the expectation that the world rhymes, something comforting about that. I think all of us have heard a song that we don't know well, but we know the word that's coming because it's a rhyming word. And we couldn't tell you the first part of the line, but we know that the poem, that line is going to end with such and such a sound. We know it before we know it. It's one of the things that helps us to memorize poems that rhyme, why it's easier to memorize a poem that rhymes. But rhyme does another thing. It converges the twain. That is, it brings together two dissociate things, not an ocean liner and an iceberg, but something in one category of life with another thing. Mass, that is the Christian celebration of the Eucharist, shouldn't appear in the same universe as poison gas. That's the irony. That's the conflict between this and that. In the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, we're not going to look at that poem next time when we talk about The Wasteland, but we could have if we had more time, published a few years before The Wasteland, and a great example of literary modernism. The speaker of that poem, a self-conscious, rather timid man, is going off to an afternoon tea that is either hosted or going to be attended by a woman he's attracted to, and he is paralyzed by fear that she will reject him. This is very much T.S. Eliot channeling his own early sexuality. And in the end, he decides not to go. And he convinces himself not to go because if she rejects him, he won't have the courage to step forward. He's so fearful of being rejected that he won't ask the question. And this is relevant to this conversation right now because he has a line, Will I, among the tea and cakes and ices, sorbets, have the strength to force the moment to its crisis? Will I, among the tea and cakes and ices, have the strength to force the moment to its crisis? Well, he doesn't. And he's so fearful, he decides not to go to this party, where he wants to simply ask, might you go out with me? And it's not Eliot who's saying that, it's Eliot who is dissecting such a personality. The utter conflict between the world of tea and cakes and ices and the drama of a man who is tortured by the fact that he has to get up all of his martial strength to go ask a girl out at a tea party shows you that he's doomed, that there's a crisis in the ices, if you understand what I mean. The gap between those two things is what's sometimes called mock heroic. There's a line in that same poem of Proof Rock that I have measured out my life in coffee spoons, that kind of trivial passing of time at society events. So after 2000 years of math, we've got as far as poison gas. This is what the modern technological progressive world has given us, a way to kill that is so far removed from the hope, the promise of peace on earth. And the distance between the two is made the stronger when they rhyme. The rhyming brings them together to show how dissociate, how different they are. And I see I'm near the top of the hour, so I'll stop. I'll let Lucy come back. And if she has something in the chat that she wants to share, I want to say again, especially if anyone's newly here that wasn't here the first time or has not attended any of these things elsewhere, I'm as good as my word. You can get my email address from Lucy or the library, and I will be a faithful correspondent, and I'll reply, even if my reply is, I don't know.
Which it never will be. I don't see any questions in the Q&A. Has anyone got anything to ask?
I'm happy to use a little bit of time, the few minutes I have, to preview
Please
the
do.
wasteland. Yeah. So I'm sure there are people in the audience, and if my friend Leslie Lambton is here tonight, I heard you might be. Welcome. Happy to know that you're out there. I'm sure some of you have read or studied and now possibly know the wasteland quite well. And for others of you, it may be completely new. That's part of the challenge of talking in a context where we can't have exchanges back and forth. I can't ask for a show of hands. So here's my advice to you. First, read it out loud. You should always read poetry out loud and slowly. When you read prose, you can not worry about getting every word right. You're reading a 500 page novel. If there's a word on every page you don't know, you can probably get a good sense of a novel, even if you don't know hundreds of words in it. But if you read a poem and you miss the meaning of a word, or worse, you miss the word completely, which can happen. We know that people who read skip phrases. Read out loud and read slowly. Think of the poem as a collage, which one author has said is the art form of the 20th century. You tear up pieces and put them back together in a kind of mismatched fashion. The opening line of this poem that we'll be talking about in April is the cruelest month, mixing memory with desire. April is cruel. I'm giving you a little bit of a head start on the poem because the world comes alive again. And it's cruel because not everybody comes back with us. When we're roused into the new year, and we all know this poignantly, some people don't make it into the new year with us, even before there was a pandemic. And the experience of coming back to life mixes memory with desire that we want to be alive and flourishing and in good weather again, and the memory of those who aren't with us. But I say this to say that this very apparently dark poem begins with the notion of resurrection in non-religious terms. The year is renewed every April. It begins with a promise. And even though the poem is called The Wasteland, and even though it is suffused by some of the darkness of the First World War, it is also a celebration of the renewal of civilization, not through progress and technology, but through ancient religion, Sanskrit, vegetation myths that suggest that the world has always seen the rites of spring, a modernist work of dance, as a renewal of the world, even though it's pagan. It is a very hopeful poem that seems loaded with darkness to make the hope that much more desirable. Read it slowly, read it out loud, and read it like a collage, that is a mishmash. It would be much better to experience the poem than to try to get it, in quotation marks. The way to appreciate a poem is not to figure out what it's saying. Poems don't say things the way that recipes or instructions in a manual say things. They are meant to give you an experience of some experience. It may be a religious or sexual or patriotic or comic or sociological experience, but it's the experience that you're after. What's it like to read The Wasteland? And that's a question that everybody who reads it carefully can answer. It's not the same answer for everyone, but that's a much better question to ask. What's it like to read The Wasteland attentively? If you do that between now and next time, we'll have a better time together. And I'll try to work in some give and take for that session where I'm not going to be quite so quick on tearing through. So if you have things to say, come prepared and we'll try to share some give and take. Thank you. Thank you for your attention. Thanks again to Lucy and the library for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Schenker. Good night, everyone.